that's not an AK-47, or if you want to be more exact, an AK Type 3. Okay, the VZ-58 is definitely not a Kalashnikov action. Hi, Misha here, and last time did a look like this involving the AKM, the stamped receiver, 7.62x39 guns. People seem to enjoy it. I enjoyed making it. So this time I thought we would kind of have the same approach, talking about the original AK-47. Well, there was an AK-47, but that was kind of the trials name, along with the AK-46, and there was even an AK-48, which wasn't adopted. In Russian service, it was really just known as the AK, but U.S. collectors tend to have Type 1, Type 2, Type 3, just to make things easier, although to be fair, Type 1 and Type 2 were only made in Russia, and in relatively limited numbers, because they're still working the kinks out. The AK Type 3, introduced around 1953-54, was the first version to be mass-produced by Mishaco in Russia, and the first to be exported to nations like Hungary, Poland, China, and others. So today we're going to look at such guns, talk about the features that make an original AK. It's not just the fact that it's built on a machined receiver. There are other features as well, namely to do with the barrel system, the sling arrangement, even the bayonet setup. It's a really interesting gun, and these original guns, they harken back to a different time. Earlier I did a video comparing the M14 to the AK, and I feel that it still holds water because they were both made with the late World War II technology, if that makes sense. So yeah, join me in here if you would, and if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe, and definitely comment, and if you'd like to help support the channel, there's a link to the Patreon page in the description. So with that, let's go to the closest thing I have to an original, authentic Russian AK. When we did the video looking at the AKM, comparing variants, there were a number of imports. But this time, we won't have so many. That's because the original AK-47, or AK Type 1, 2, or 3, as you would prefer to call it, was only manufactured by a handful of nations, and primarily in Russia, Soviet Russia. And that was really only between 1949 and 1960 at the most. And even then, primary full-scale whoop-de-doop manufacturing was only for a few years, 54 up to maybe 58. So we're going to have a lot more kit builds, including this one here, which you've seen in many videos, but hey, why not? It's my best example of a Russian AK Type 3, AK-47. This is an old build I've had for a long time. It's one of the old Israeli, well, the kits came out of Israel. They've been captured from the PLO, and the receivers were cut up and they were rebuilt on U.S. receivers, or sometimes Bulgarian. This one's on an old firing line. And this is a good example of a transitional. So, let's go back a little bit in time. If you would like a video on the actual evolution and development of the Kalashnikov, please let me know. But this all started back in World War II. The Russians began studying what Germany was doing all the way back in 1942, and in 1943 they got their hands on some of the new 8mm Kurz ammo, which very quickly led to them developing their own intermediate round, actually originally known as 7.62-41, but reworked around 1946 into 7.62x39, what we know today, M43. Work would go throughout, and the basis for the AK would be in submachine guns. In fact, Mikhail Kalashnikov's first design or two were submachine guns. And an early contender was actually the AS-44, but that design, while it was put into very limited production, didn't go much of anywhere. In 1940, well, the designer died, so that will do it. In 1946, you had as many as 16 designs competing. This was scaled down around November December to 6, and then eventually 3, including the Kalashnikov. This is what we would know as the AK-46 prototype. It's actually very different. In fact, it was a short stroke gas piston gun with a totally different receiver styling. This would be reworked in 1947, becoming the AK number 1, 2, 3, 4 different designs, including stamped and milled ideas. At the end of 47, it would essentially be finalized and go into testing in 1948, being adopted. The AK at that time wasn't the most accurate. In fact, it was one of the least accurate guns being tested, but it did have two things Russia loved. It was reliable, and it was relatively cheap to mass produce. And as we know, in 1949, the AK Type 1, sometimes also called the AK-49, would come out with an early stamped receiver with machine trunnions. But the rejection rate for the stampings was so high that in 1950, Mishaco, who was manufacturing these, asked permission to switch to a more traditional machined receiver, kind of like what was being used in the SKS and others. And this was granted, and so by the end of 1950, the AK Type 2 comes about. Now, these were both produced in somewhat numbers, but they were kind of transitional. In 1953, the AK Type 3 design first appears, and it is in full-scale production by 1954. The reason I'm kind of hedging the years, and the years you'll kind of find are a little different, is because there are transitional guns. Some AK Type 2s will have some older Type 1 features, and some early Type 3s had a lot of late Type 2 features. The main differences between Type 2 and Type 3 had to do with the receiver. The Type 3 receiver was streamlined from ball stroke steel, and it had a different trunnion system. Interestingly, the AK Type 2 used the same receiver for underfolding and fixed stock guns, but the Type 3 had dedicated receivers for each type. The way the AK Type 2 used the same receiver chunk was the end socket was interchangeable. Well, not so much interchangeable as, modular at the factory. You know what I mean. So, yeah, the AK Type 3 was the production model, the finalized version, and that's what we have here. This has a 16¼ inch heavy, or at least medium heavy profile barrel. It's threaded 14 millimeter. It has a long stroke gas piston, ported gas tube, 45-degree gas block, slab side wooden handguards. The rear sights are adjustable out to 800 meters. It has a smooth top cover. Now this is an AK Type 3 with a AK Type 2 cover that's really thick. The Type 3 cover was a little bit thinner. In fact, this also has transitional AK-2-3 furniture on it as well. Of course, the receiver's US, so that doesn't really matter. And they used this type of 30-round magazine made from 1 millimeter thick stamped steel. These magazines, especially loaded, are heavy, and they were issued typically in a pouch with 5 total. So, yeah, heavy. And this gun, because of the machined receiver, the pretty slab side furniture, the heavier barrel, you're looking at 9 to 9.5 pounds. Lightweight wasn't really a concept back then. This was done for ease of production and to use the tooling that Mishaco had at the time. And Russia would build these only at Mishaco, replacing the original AK-47 with the AKM in 1959, and production would switch over very soon by 1960. I did want to also mention the bayonet here, because it's kind of interesting. This bayonet was not initially with the design. Remember, this was starting off as a submachine gun, which you don't typically need a bayonet for. Well, around 1950, already after the Type 1 was in production, they decided they wanted a bayonet. This is when the idea of it being more of a rifle was just starting to dawn on them. So they notched the underside of the front sight base, and then they modified the SVT-40 pattern of bayonet with these rings to, lock on. You've seen it before. And here it is on the gun. That's why it is a bit of an ad hoc design, something kind of retrofitted to it. It's a longer blade than the AKM would later use, but it doesn't double as a wire cutter or utility knife or a saw blade. It's literally just a stabby thing. And that's why when they did the AKM, one of the things was to have a true dedicated type bayonet system and to be more efficient with it. But it is unique to the original AK. One other thing I should point out, while pretty much all Type 3s had chrome-lined bores, the original Type 1s did not. The SKS itself did not receive chroming until about 1950, and the AK, being also manufactured around the same time, received it around 1950. So, yeah, when the Type 1 first came around, the bores were not necessarily chromed. But remember that there are plenty of transitional guns that have features of both. Of course, it has the top tang with one screw and the bottom tang with two. The sling swivel is on the left side of the receiver wall. The buttstock has a very noticeable downward sweep. And we have a storage compartment for a toolkit, cleaning kit, and the buttstock. Now, these Russian guns never had what we think of as Russian red wood. Not with the AK Type 3s. It was more of a brown to kind of honey-colored, says the blind guy. The Russian red thing is, well, it's a story for another day, but no, that wouldn't have it. And they did have a blued finish, relatively high polish for a military gun. In fact, quality was relatively high. Now, in Russia, manufacturing, like I said, would be over by 1960, and these would stay in Russian service, increasingly being pushed to the back lines until about 1974, by which time they were officially declared obsolescent. This is when the AK-74 was coming in, so the AKM became the second line. And so that was the story within Russia. But now, let's talk about variants. Hungarian AK-55. First up, the Hungarian AK-55. Now, Russia did not export the AK Type 1 or Type 2. Not the design for manufacture, although some places would end up with second-hand guns. With the AK Type 3, around 1954-55, Russia began considering selling guns en masse and even giving production licenses. And when I say giving, I don't mean for free. There was always a cost associated with it, even if it wasn't always, strictly speaking, monetary. Now, this is called the AK-55 because that was the first year that Hungary actually looked into the AK Type 3 and acquired some Russian-made examples. Actual production in Hungary did not start until, well, they started setting up in 1957 after the Hungarian revolution or uprising that previous year, and main production would run. Really, there was just a big run between 1960 and 1963, although there are some guns made in 58 and 59 to kind of get going. And these were almost exact copies of Russian. Now, this is another kit build, although from a lot of imported parts. Of course, this is a Hungarian kit on a Bulgarian machined receiver. And it's pretty all correct as far as it goes. All the features are the same caliber. Now, what's interesting, FEG is credited with putting these together, and that's true. But many parts were actually subcontracted out, and namely the receiver, which these were created by a factory named Danuvia that was actually around in World War II, and the somewhat unique Hungarian blonde wood furniture. This was contracted out as well. The sling swivel still on the side. This has a true Type 3 top cover. Checkered pistol grip, which Russia did some of those as well. One reason I picked this build of all the SLR 100s is it actually uses the original machined mag catch, whereas a lot of them don't. Small thing, but it was important to me. And I really like these SLR 100s, as I've said in many videos. One thing to point out, the magazines. The, we'll call it Type 1 mag, the slab side steel mag, was used by a lot of nations, but only really made in Russia by Izhevsk. By the time these guns are being produced abroad, the newer, thinner-walled, ribbed magazines were coming around. And so that's what you'll mostly see, including with the AK-55, at least if it was using domestically made mags. Now this has a phosphate finish because of the US builder. Originally these had a blued finish with the carrier in the white, although around 1970 Hungary did refurbish and sometimes phosphate some of their older AK-55 guns before then giving them away to friendlies as, foreign aid. Even though they only built them for a few years, they're considered a high-quality gun, and it really let FEG cut its teeth and learn the Kalashnikov pattern. And so that is important. And then about 20 years ago, large numbers of these kits were in America, and so you'll see lots of builds. But yeah, aside from a few differences like the type of wood used for the furniture, and just a few just tiny things like machine cuts for the receiver, this is a very good clone copy, licensed of the original Russian AK. And I really like this gun. It's a really fun shooter. Next up, the Chinese Type 56. Adopted in 1956 and very quickly put into production at Factory 66. The earliest Chinese guns were assembled using Russian parts and assistance, and throughout the next 3-4 years they would transition over to more domestically made components. The original Type 56 were very close to the Russian, but already by 1960 you would start to see some uniquely Chinese things like the completely hooded front sight. A few years later you had the very unique Chinese spike underfolding bayonet. They would also introduce the Chinese Flatback Magazine. They actually made this mag for easier manufacturing, but it is a little more comfortable to grab without having a spine in the back kind of stabbing your hand. They seem a little lighter weight to me too as well, which makes sense. And of course, beginning in 1967 and up to 1970, they started replacing the machined receiver with a stamped one. So the design would change. I talked about more in the AKM video how the direction China went. This is, of course, a Polytech AK-47S, aka the Legend. If you want an wholly imported gun, this is one of the very, very few options for a machined receiver AK Type 3. So that's a good. And when these came in, they were very affordable. But people can't accept that this is a good clone, but not great. And it's not a great clone. It does have several shortcomings. It is not an exact Russian Type 3. To its credit, it does use an authentic machined receiver, not cast, and it does have a blued metal finish with the carrier left in the white. Nice. But, for one thing, these do not have near the number of serialized parts. It's actually quite interesting. A lot of things are not serialized on these, like the recoil guide. Sometimes even the top cover or the gas tube are not serialized, whereas on a Russian gun they would be. Also, the type of wood for the furniture is different. It's not the same type of birch. Arctic, I believe, on the Russian. So that's a few things. Now the front end is similar, of course, with this type of lug here, except the front sight base is cast, not machined as on the original. Also, the handguard is different. See what I mean? This upper is a straight cut on the wood. This has not vent slots, but you see what I mean. It's a different cut up here to the slots here. It's just a little different all around. Now, the rear sight on the gun is 800 meter, but it It's kind of faux Russian markings, if that makes sense. They did their best. It just feels a little different the way it's machined. And the same thing goes for the mag catch. This is a machined paddle here, very thick actually. And this is a stamped paddle. That's fine. It's just something worth noting. The safety too is a slightly different shape. But probably the biggest noticeable thing externally, the trigger guard only has one rivet per side up here, whereas on any original gun, there'd be 2 rivets. Under the hood, the recoil guide is different as well. With the Russian gun, and like the Hungarian, this is a machined hollow tube. This uses more of the AKM type wire guide. On the other hand, it does use a double hook trigger still instead of the later single hook. It's hard to explain things like the cut of the wood, but it is just a little different. I'm sorry if that's a little confusing. I'm sure it is. Just to flip them over, to their credit, they do have a muzzle nut, Type 1 bayonet lug. Again, I hope you can see how this is just completely smooth and this has notches. I hate to call them vents, but I don't know what you call them, vent cuts or whatever. Ported gas tube. The lightning cuts are pretty good. And it does have the sling swivel. And it does have the 2 tangs. It's a good gun, and for what these sold for back in the 80s, $400 with several mags, great. But you can tell it's something made in the 1980s to be a replica, not an original. Like many of the other Chinese. Look at a Chinese replica Uzi, or a Chinese replica 1911, or a Chinese replica Winchester 1897 trench gun. The legend is like that. You can, very, very good gun and quite authentic, but you can tell it's not an old gun. It just has that more modern manufacturer feel to it. But yeah, China would make millions of Type 56s, and they would export them to many nations, including places like Albania. They would actually inspire some local nations there, like say North Korea, to build a close copy known as the Type 58, 58A for fixed and 58B for folding versions, as it happens. And no, I don't have a North Korean anything to show you, because even parts for them are exceedingly rare in the USA. But back to my original point, if you do want an import, this is about your only option, certainly from the pre-Baron era. So they are what they are. I take the Polytech legend as it is, and don't try to make it into something it's not. Moving right along, we come to the Polish. Well, it changed names a few times. The PMK, later the KBK AK. Although this one is technically the KBKG WZ 1960 variant. Poland started looking into the SKS and the AK in 1954, and initially they were going to build both. But the SKS was canceled, and the AK would go forward with production setting up on a limited scale in 1957 and ramping up by 1958. And like I said, in 1960, this version came out as a dedicated grenade, well, not dedicated, but rifle grenade launching version that was designed more in Poland. It's kind of a unique variant, but it's still very much an AK Type 3. And the standard PMK and the PMKS folder, for that matter, were very, very close. And like the Hungarian, this was built from a kit here on a Bulgarian receiver. Not a whole lot else to say. These originally had a blued finish. Later versions would have a paint. They would use hardwood furniture originally. Later they would go to laminate, including a synthetic pistol grip. Poland wouldn't actually go to the AKM in production until 1966, and even then they kept the grenade launching version around well into the 70s because they did not feel like the AKM was strong enough to launch grenades. So while the standard PMK or KBK AK was retired earlier, the grenade launching versions would carry along, and actually with some would get paint finish and reworks, and there would even be a QD detaching stock version. And Poland was known for extremely high quality and very pretty bluing too. They would produce a blued version of the ribbed magazine. Still has the same barrel. For the grenade launching, the plunger is larger, and actually the end of the barrel has a bit of a funnel, a bit of a taper to work with the screw-on attachment. Interesting thing, Russia had the AK with the 14mm threads from the get-go, planning to have all these kind of attachments and accoutrements and instruments for it, and they never really did. It wasn't until the AKM and even AK-74 that they started issuing more screw-on devices. But the option was always there, and Poland took advantage of it with the 1960 model here. Of course, the gas cutoff, slab side handguards, standard rear sight. See, this one has the stamped kind of later style mag catch. That's what I was saying earlier about the SLR 100Hs. Most of them have it. This is a 99P. This is the Polish slab pistol grip. This is a bracket in the back for attaching the grenade boot. And it does have the sling swivel on the stock as opposed to the side of the receiver. I suspect they moved it there so when firing a rifle grenade, the sling wouldn't slap the tar out of the shooter. And there's also a top cover latch lock, manual lock here. You know the deal. Very cool guns though. But yeah, Poland would make the AK roughly from 1958 up through the mid-60s. And they would do the underfolding version as well. Parts kits have come in for years, and the Century 1960 Sporter is one of the good Century guns, at least for the money and when it came out. So, yeah. Just thought we would mention that. You know how I feel about Polish guns. Mini Jack, last mag of the, well, almost night now. And it shoots.
And then some.
Now we come to Bulgaria and their AK, sometimes referred to as the AK-47 M1. In 1956, negotiations were underway with Russia and Bulgaria. By 58, production was ramping up at Factory 10, later known as Arsenal. And by 1960, Arsenal was pretty much ready to go, making all their parts and no longer relying on Russian. And originally they made an exact clone copy of the Russian gun. But the story gets interesting. When everyone else went over to the AKM, Bulgaria did not at all. They kept making the AK-47, the AK Type 3, and actually started making changes. And they would incorporate some elements from the AKM, including going away from a screw-in barrel. Oh, that's one thing I did not mention about the Chinese. I do apologize, but we'll revisit that later. And they went to a pressed and pinned-in barrel, and eventually they would replace the blued finish with the AKM-style paint over phosphate finish. And they would even start using some stamped parts like the mag catch, and the recoil guide would get the lip on top. And eventually they would go away from wood to synthetic furniture, several types used. Now this, of course, is my SA-93, the one I used to tease in the AKM video. And there's a reason I did not want this to be an AK Type 3 clone. Because to make it in one of these, you'd have to replace virtually every part. At that point, might as well get a Hungarian SLR 100. Better, in my mind, my own opinion, to make this into a late production Bulgarian AK-47 M1. Now they did make stamped receiver guns, but these were the 545 offering, which they went to in the 1980s. And of course there would be the commercial SLRs that were sent over here, but that's a story for another day. They replaced the wood, though, first with this interesting furniture, kind of salmon-colored stock and grip, and then handguards made of AG4, so-called Bakelite. But they kept all the other features with the front sight bayonet lug, ported gas tube, medium heavy profile barrel, all that good stuff. So they really do become hybrids. The SA-93 is a true import, much like that Legend, but made in the 1990s. But because they came in post-89, they came in neutered. So unless you like the thumbhole stock look, they did have wood furniture at least, you needed to do something. And this is what's done this one. But personal choice to have a late style. Now eventually this kind of AK-47 barrel would give way to an AK-74 style barrel. Look at your SAM 7R or your SAM 7SF, and it has same length barrel but a thinner profile, and it has the 90-degree gas block. It has an AKM/AK-74 style lug. Yeah, so the newer guns, known as the AR-M1, AR-M9, that whole family, they're really their own critter, while the receiver is inspired by the Type 3, again with the press and pin barrel. The front end is really not, so that's why I picked this, because it's still in that same family design. But you do have to convert these, and that's a thing to just know. Installing the sling swivel here, notice there's no swivel on this stock. It's an interesting stock, I'll give it that. Slab side handguards, and of course they did an underfolding stock version as well. But Arsenal really has run with the milled receiver. China, as I said, for military purposes, did away with it around 1970. Bulgaria would do away with it temporarily for the 74 series, but as soon as they could, they went back to it. And they've made it kind of their emblem. And they've even, of course, introduced newer style mags. Originally, they made the same ribbed mags as anyone else. But, of course, then you would go to the Arsenal waffle mag. And high-quality mag today. Now, like I said, I did forget to mention a minute ago that the Legend 2 has a pressed and pinned, not a screw-in barrel like this one, and the original Russians. It's a manufacturing difference. It also makes head spacing and rebarreling a lot easier. Another maker we should talk about, I don't have one to show you, East Germany. They too would adopt the AK, of course, putting it into production around the same time as Bulgaria, as the MPI-K fixed stock and MPI-KS underfolding. Still classing it as a submachine gun. That's what MPI basically was in German. But it had a few interesting differences. For one, it didn't have the cleaning rod under the barrel, and it had kind of beechwood furniture, and it lacked the cleaning kit compartment, much like this one doesn't have. Well, there's wood. It also had a different style of sling attachment, more Mauser style. I would love to have one, but obviously there are no semi-auto East Germans at all, and the East German parts kits are exceedingly rare and thus exceedingly expensive, and thus you don't see me with one. Sorry, but you know, we all have our limits. But they are cool, and I wanted to give note to East Germany because alongside Poland, these two nations are kind of credited with making the prettiest, the highest quality fit and finish AK type guns. And actually East Germany was a major importer for the Com Block back in its day. But yeah, there was also the SLR 96, which was very similar to this gun, and the SLR 95 was more of the modern AR M1 style. It's a whole thing. Bulgaria loves their mill guns. And again, no Bulgarian AKMs. And with that, we really come to the end of the true clone licensed copy guns. But we're not done with the video, as you can probably tell by the time bar there. SAM 7R. The Yugoslavian AP M70. And so we're back to another kit gun. There are no really semi-auto milled imports, not in 7.62 by 39. There are some milled imports that Mitchell's did, but they tend to be in 8mm in different configurations anyway. Luckily, we've had a lot of parts kits come over, and this is a re-weld from that. And this is a really interesting story. Yugoslavia eventually did get the license essentially for free for the SKS to try to get them in the Soviet Union's good graces. This was after Stalin and all that. So they had that. But Zastava factory, they never had a license to build the AK, the Kalashnikov. They would reverse engineer, but they didn't want to just copy the Type 3. No. They had their own notions from the very beginning. And that's exactly what they did. Their guns had the 16.25-inch barrel, heavy, well, medium heavy profile, but they were not chrome lined. Now the earliest guns were, we kind of call them M64s today, but they really didn't have that official designation. In fact, they weren't adopted until 1970 as the M70. It's a whole thing, story for another day. One of the big things they wanted, rifle grenade launching capabilities. So we get that as a gas cutoff, and we get a spring-loaded retaining catch in the back. We get a rubber recoil pad, so kind of like the Polish, beefed up for that. They also gave night sights, something that was on their SKS, at least some of them as well. Kind of neat. And the original gun started off as a milled receiver, with one neat feature we'll talk about in a minute. Now, this was a very unique milled receiver. Had a slab on the left side, no lightning cut, and it used more of a socket style, kind of sort of reminiscent of a Type 2 receiver, but not really. And that's why the stocks, there's no tangs, and the trunnion is internal with one big screw. There's no cleaning kit compartment. Originally we had wood pistol grips. Later they would go to this synthetic style. Early ones had a metal tang or ferrule on top. Later they would get rid of that. Of course, the sling swivels on the side. And they would have a blued finish originally. Yeah, they're really interesting. Oh, and the longer 3-vent hole handguards. They are clearly inspired by Kalashnikov, but very much not a copy, and a lot of parts don't even interchange. In fact, the only furniture piece that does is the pistol grip, and only that kind of sort of buttstock and handguards, absolutely not. So, the original M64 would give way to the M70. And this was a simplified milled receiver for mass production, mainly going away from a screw-in barrel to a press and pin-in barrel. They would also go to a slightly thinner top cover and a few other things too, but it's still very heavy duty. Now in the AKM video you saw my OPAP standing in for the M70B1. It wouldn't be long before the machined receiver would be replaced with a unique Yugo pattern stamped receiver, but they kind of followed a very similar path to China. Another very unique thing, the magazine. At first, the outside might look like a standard ribbed mag, but it's not. The ribbing's different, and the bottom is very different, and it's pretty heavy gauge, kind of like the original Russian, but ribbed. And of course, it had the one feature that Zastava mags are famous for today. Last round hold open. Now with the M70, they introduced a simple last round hold open to the follower of the magazine. So when you pull the mag out, the bolt goes forward. It's just a bump, as you know. I'm sure you know this. However, originally with the M64, there was actually an entire device in here. That's why the slab side receiver on the side there. That was an automatic last round hold open. That also meant that the mags are not interchangeable with other Comblot mags at all. And I think they wanted to get away from that and kind of simplify the design. But from the very beginning, Zastava, the Yugoslavians, recognized that not having a bolt hold open, last round holdback, was a fault, a failure of the Kalashnikov design. And from the very beginning, they set out to rectify that. Eventually they went with a very simple way that is only kind of half effective. Later they would add the notch to the safety to kind of make a ad hoc last round system, but yeah. Yugo guns are really cool, really interesting. And quality is pretty good. And later they would start using the AKM bayonet lug, like on this one, versus the original type. There's a lot of variations of the so-called M64s just because they were essentially advanced prototypes. With the M70 and M70B1, they would standardize. Maybe one day as Zastava USA will import a milled M70. That would be pretty neat. And of course they had an underfolding version too, as I'm sure you're very well. There's a lot of guns. And again, no chrome line bores on these. Kind of interesting. Unique pistol grip. So yeah, unlicensed clone and copy that still looks like an AK from a distance, but when you get close, it's pretty different. Ironically, our next and final gun is kind of the reverse. The Finnish AK-62. Of course, we had to end here because this was the first AK-type gun, first 7.62x39 semi-auto gun ever to be imported in the USA back in the very late 60s and 70s. And, we could kind of talk about its evolution all on its own too, much like Yugoslavia. This was not licensed from Russia as such. Now, Finland did purchase some Type 3s. Some say from Poland, some say they were Russian, some say they were Russian guns via Poland. Those are known as the AK-54. These were for testing, and they were for training and reserve. But they wanted to winterize and kind of do their own thing. Think of it as the same thing they did to the Mosin Nagant, turning it from the M91 into eventually the M39. And at first this looks very different because it's very different furniture. But actually under the hood, the bolt group, the trigger group, even the magazine style, it's an AK. It's just it has a different sighting system. Again, the fins doing their thing. It is a milled receiver, although they did what they could to lighten it up a bit. It has additional lightning cuts and is a more trim receiver. Still has a 16¼ inch barrel, although it is not chrome lined. A very unique pinned on muzzle device. Flip up night sights, exposed gas tube, cheese grater handguards. Very interesting pistol grip. Parts aren't really interchangeable with a standard AK, but it is definitely an AK inspired gun. There would be trials in the early 60s, and eventually the M62 would lead to the the M60, then the M62 into the full production RK62, which was put into service by 1965 and produced throughout the 70s. And eventually a modernized version, the RK95, would be built by Seiko in very small numbers, about 20,000 in the 90s. But Valmet themselves would close down their firearms production line in the 80s. So we had some come in here. Now, I said that the magazines are very much like standard, pretty much Polish, except of course, as I'm sure most of you know, they have a lanyard loop welded to the base. That's for use in the snow because the Finns are they're thoughtful like that. Mostly just because I came across it when I was getting the Type 1 bayonet for the Russian. Here's the Finnish bayonet. Totally different style and pattern. Slides on. The puka. It's actually inspired by the VZ58 bayonet, the one you saw me teasing at the beginning of the video. Same system, basically. But this is meant to be more of a hunting knife that can be snapped onto your gun if needs be. Nice reindeer scabbard, too. And of course, as many of you know, this would inspire and lead to the Galil in Israel, but as also many of you know, I don't exactly consider the Galil an AK. It's just one step too removed. This is barely an AK because of what's under the hood, but then the Galil takes it, chambers it for 5.56 instead of 7.62x39, and further refines the sights and all that. The Galil's a cool gun, but it's just too many changes to really keep it an AK. I'll go and say it's inspired by the AK, but no more. See the lightning cut here, machined receiver, phosphate, parkerized finish. These were built to be tough and to get as much accuracy out of 7.62 by 39 as Finland could. On the other hand, they were fighting in heavily forested areas, so super long range wasn't always a concern. The buttstock is interesting. It's tubular steel, of course, has a large cleaning kit compartment, leather scabbard. They did briefly import a more AKM-looking version with a stamped receiver known as the M71 into the USA, but these were 223. And Finland, the FDF, the military looked at adopting them, but they weren't tough enough. That would lead to the M76, which they would adopt in small numbers. Finland would also purchase large numbers of Chinese and East German guns to supplement and have in reserve. But the AK-62 is still in service today, although many are the modernized 62M versions. Unfortunately, the Finnish imports are scarce today and starting to go crazy priced. And Bayonet is not only out of production, but so is Mishaco, so the chances of getting more in are not super great. I'm kind of hurrying through this one simply because planning on doing a special Bayonet video later on this year, so we'll get into more detail then and there. But inspired by the Type 3 and Finland kind of doing its own thing. And to be fair, it was the first semi-AK we ever had in the USA. And there we go, folks. That's what I've got to show you for the AKs. Let's have some final thoughts. Bayonet.
They'll probably hear you talking about shooting it, and then it'll just cut off.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. It was a lot of fun to make. Figured it'd be good for the weekend. Yeah, early on, nations pretty much produced exact copies. Maybe the furniture would vary a little bit, and later someone like Poland would do a few specialized versions, and of course there are the underfolding versions. But then Yugoslavia definitely did their thing, and then Finland really took the gun in its own direction. But these all are magazine interchangeable, which is neat, using the same cartridge, have the same basic barrel length, same long stroke, 2-lug rotating bolt gas system, and bolt. Yeah. And they're from a different time. Unfortunately, there are not very many good imports, and the ones that are here tend to be very expensive today. And that is one reason I do encourage people, if they want a mill gun, look into the arsenals, because once the SAM-7s are gone, I bet they meet a similar fate to these legends up here. That just tends to be the way of things. When they're here, they're here. People kind of take advantage of them and take them for granted. And then when they're gone, like this Bayonet, people decide, wait a minute, that was a really cool gun after all. Why didn't I buy one? I don't know. Get the credit card out, Mom. But, yeah, at this point, even with the Type 3, which was put into full production, these were made only in the millions. It would be the AKM that would take the AK into the tens of millions and upwards of 100 million rifles. But it all began with the original Kalashnikov system and becoming one of the most prolific rifles in the world today. And you still see modernized versions, be it from Arsenal, or if you want to consider the Galil Ace, that's an existing thing. And even in Finland, the AK-95, while it has been out of production for 25 years, is still pretty modern, all things considered. But kit building mill guns is a lot of fun. Unfortunately, the kits have dried up and the barrels are harder to get now. But for a time, you could do it. Or you could get the Bulgarian receivers and build with, like this here. Or the one over here, the Polish. I don't know, I really like these. They're a lot of fun to shoot too. But I just wanted to give credit. Again, the first video on the AKM was, popular. So figured, why not do this one? I'd like to hear what you think is your favorite variant. Maybe you like the look of the East German. Maybe you like the Chinese 56. Who knows? Let me know, though. I also wanted to mention a lot of nations never actually manufactured the AK-47, AK Type 3, but did issue it. For example, Romania. They would call it the PM AK, but they wouldn't actually start making a version until the AKM was out. That would be the PM63 that we know and love. We talked about in the last video. This was a common thing. A lot of nations would simply purchase these from Russia or China, and then when the AKM came around, they would actually start building them. So you see a lot more AKM variants. Egypt is another example. They had some AK types and would put the AKM into production. So something of note. Alright guys, been talking long enough. If you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to the Patreon page. And for those who love the Galil Ace, we've actually got a fresh video coming up soon, so don't think I'm snarking on it. And like I said, if it seemed like I was kind of rushing through the Bayonet, that's because it's getting an updated video pretty soon as well. The Chinese guns recently had an updated video. And you know me, I can't help but talk about arsenals quite frequently, and the same goes for Polish and Hungarian guns. So I try to give them all some love and attention. And with so few new guns coming out, and those that do being so darn expensive, sometimes I just like to get the old favorites out and just be glad that I picked them up back when they were several $100s instead of several thousand, because, gotta be honest with you guys, I love the AK. But if I was starting off today, I don't know that I could bring myself to pay 21st century prices, 2022 especially. I don't know, you never know till you're in that position, but what got me into them was how accessible they were for not a lot of dough, even the milled guns. By the way, my very first milled gun, it was a Hungarian AK-55 kit build. Just thought I'd share that. Again, I appreciate it. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon. Next time.